Hello, I'm Talia Martinez, Safety Consultant with the Kentucky Education and Labor Cabinet. This module covers the Focus 4 hazards in relation to construction. Construction is one of the most dangerous industries to be in. In 2020, the number of fatal injuries in construction was more than triple that of manufacturing. Through data and statistics, federal OSHA has determined that there are 4 major categories that cause serious injury or death on a construction site. They labeled these hazards the Focus 4. The purpose of this module is to make Kentucky's construction workers aware of the Focus 4 and to educate them on safe work practices regarding these hazards. Within this module, we'll identify each of the Focus 4 hazards and discuss each of them briefly. We will discuss examples of each and where they can be found on a construction site. We'll also discuss the employer's responsibilities. OSHA's Focus 4 hazards are falls, electrocutions, struck by, and caught in or between. When we talk about falls, we aren't just talking about the physical fall itself. We're talking about fall hazards, or situations that could cause a worker to fall. According to the 2019 Bureau of Labor Statistics information, there were 1,102 fatal injuries in the construction industry. Approximately 418 of those deaths were the result of a fall. 38% of the fatalities in construction in 2019 were from falls. Falls from a roof were the most common fatal fall between the years of 2015 and 2017, making up a total of 32% of the fatal falls to a lower level. So why are fall hazards common in the construction industry? Well, we build from the ground up. The work is constantly changing and the job site is always evolving as the project progresses. In general, the trigger height for fall protection in construction is 6 feet, meaning if a worker is on a roof or a platform that exceeds 6 feet in height, then they're required to have fall protection. Notice I said in general. There are some situations that the trigger height is less or greater than 6 feet, such as the trigger height for scaffolds. It's 10 feet, and when working in an aerial lift, the requirement for fall protection kicks in as soon as they get in the bucket. If there is not a specific fall protection requirement for a situation, then the trigger height is 6 feet in construction. Fall protection doesn't just mean a personal fall arrest system. There are other options. Some types of protection are better than others, depending on the situation. The 3 main types of fall protection are personal fall arrest systems, guardrails, and limited access zones. When working on a low-sloped roof, for example, one option is a limited access zone with a warning line. This protects workers if they stay inside the perimeter of the warning line and at least 6 feet away from the edge of the roof. Once they go outside the warning line, a personal fall arrest system is required. A roof is not the only place that a worker could fall from on a construction site. Employees working on aerial lifts are exposed to fall hazards. Whenever a worker is performing work in an aerial lift, they're required to have a personal fall arrest system to prevent them from being ejected from the platform while moving. It should be noted that the requirement is for aerial lifts. It is not a requirement to have fall protection in a scissor lift. Uncovered holes and skylights are also fall hazards. Holes greater than 2 inches are required to be covered, and skylights are required to be guarded. Ladders and scaffolds have the potential to pose a fall hazard as well. They must be inspected before they are used, and they must be used in accordance with the way that they were designed to be used by the manufacturer. Earlier, I mentioned that the trigger height for fall protection in construction is 6 feet, but that with scaffolds, it was 10 feet. This is typically 2 bucks of scaffolding. What are employers required to do to protect workers from falls? The biggest and the most obvious one is to provide fall protection. OSHA's fall protection standards require employers to provide fall protection when workers are exposed to a fall hazard. The standards set the criteria and practices for fall protection systems and require training. The standards cover hazard assessment, fall protection, and safety monitoring systems. Controlled access zones, safety nets, and guardrails, personal fall arrest systems, warning lines, and positioning device systems are also addressed. The following are some things that employers should do to prevent fall hazards on a construction site. They can develop a written fall protection plan. Employers should identify potential fall hazards prior to each project and during daily walkarounds. They should pay attention to hazards associated with routine and non-routine tasks. Employers should also eliminate the need for fall protection where possible by either rescheduling the task, isolating the task, or changing the task. Employers should ensure that fall protection equipment is appropriate to the task, in good condition, and used properly. They should conduct general fall prevention training on a regular basis. They should also train workers on the specific fall hazards identified and on the required personal protective equipment. Employers should conduct regular inspections of fall protection equipment in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations and OSHA's requirements. Employers should also emphasize fall hazards that are unique to the site, such as open floor holes or shafts, riser penetrations, and skylights. What else are employers required to do in relation to falls? Employers should ensure proper scaffold construction. Employers must construct all scaffolds according to the manufacturer's instructions. A competent person must supervise as scaffolds are being erected, moved, taken apart, or changed, and they also must inspect the scaffolding. A guardrail system or a personal fall arrest system is required for scaffolds more than 10 feet above the lower level. In addition, employers must provide safe access to and from scaffold platforms. Employers also need to evaluate ladder use and condition. Employers are required to provide ladders when necessary and maintain the ladders in proper condition. Employers must also train workers to recognize ladder and stairway hazards. Employers also must ensure worksite maintenance. Poor worksite maintenance can lead to clutter and debris on a construction site, creating additional slip, trip, and fall hazards. Poor maintenance of ladders, scaffolds, and fall protection equipment can also lead to serious injuries. Employers are required to keep work sites free of form and scrap lumber with protruding nails and other waste and trash, including combustible debris. Employers are also required to provide training. As discussed, employers must provide workers with training on fall hazards and the required PPE. OSHA also has specific hazards that require employers to train workers when doing work with scaffolds and ladders. If a worker sees fall hazards or has any questions about fall prevention, they should contact their supervisor. Do not work until unsafe conditions have been corrected. Fall protection is covered in more detail in our other webinars and modules at www.kysafe.ky.gov. Moving on to the next Focus 4 hazard, let's talk about struck-by hazards. A struck-by hazard is any material, vehicle, or item that has the potential to strike or fall on a worker. In 2020, there were 13,640 non-fatal struck-by events and 158 fatal struck-by incidents. Now, when we think of someone being struck by something on a construction site, we normally think of vehicles and heavy equipment. While this is not wrong, there are a few other circumstances where struck-by hazards are present. Not only can a worker be struck by a vehicle or equipment running into them, there are also components of a vehicle that can strike a worker as well. For example, the swing radius on a crane or an excavator. Though there is no requirement to have the swing radius marked on an excavator, it's required to be marked on a crane. Keep in mind, even though it is not required to be marked on an excavator, it is still a recognized hazard, and workers should be aware when they are working around excavators. Struck-by hazards are not limited to heavy machinery and motorized equipment. Included under the struck-by hazards umbrella are falling objects, materials, tools, and even loads. If a worker is on a lower level and there is potential for materials or tools to fall from an upper level, then a tow board or some other means to prevent the materials from falling, such as securing materials or tools, is required. Another struck-by hazard involving cranes is falling loads. Workers should never stand or work under a load on a crane or other hoisted materials. Not only is the swing radius a struck-by hazard with machinery, but employees are also at risk of being run over by equipment. Workers should be aware of pedestrian pathways and vehicular traffic pathways. If the construction site has designated paths, then they should be followed accordingly. However, if the site is not equipped with designated paths, workers and operators should make sure to be aware of their surroundings and also wear high visibility clothing. Pedestrians should never cross the path of motorized equipment unless they've made eye contact with the operator and have been signaled to pass. What are employers required to do in relation to struck-by hazards? With heavy equipment such as cranes and excavators, employers must determine whether the ground is sufficiently level and firm to support the anticipated weight of hoisting equipment and associated loads. They also need to assess the hazards within the work zone that would affect the safe operation of hoisting equipment, such as power lines and objects or personnel that would be within the swing radius of the hoisting equipment. Employers need to erect barriers to mark the area covered by rotating superstructure to warn workers of the danger zone. They also need to ensure that the equipment is in safe operating condition via the required inspections. Employers must also comply with all manufacturer procedures regarding proper operational functions of equipment, including its use with attachments. They need to ensure the safe attachment of rigging devices such as shackles, hooks, eye bolts, spreader beams and slings, wedge sockets, and wire rope clips. Never saddle a dead horse. They also need to provide seatbelts when they're required. They also need to ensure that roadways and grades are maintained to accommodate the safe movement of equipment and vehicles. They must also ensure that all earth-moving or compacting equipment with an obstructed view does not operate in reverse gear unless the equipment has a reverse signal alarm or a worker has been designated to signal when it's safe. Regarding motor vehicles such as trucks or cars, employers are required to conduct a hazard assessment of the work site using the job site coordinator, which is usually a supervisor or a foreman. They also must post construction areas with legible traffic signs at points of hazards. They must also erect barricades that conform to the manual on uniform traffic control devices. They need to place necessary warning signs along the road, and all workers on the work site should have a safety and operations orientation. Employers must ensure that all hand tools are maintained and in good condition. The use of unsafe or damaged hand tools is not permitted, such as sprung jaws on wrenches, no mushroom heads, no splinters or cracks in wooden handles. Employers must ensure that saws are equipped with guards and have a constant pressure switch that will shut off the power when the pressure is released. They must ensure that safety guards are on all abrasive wheel, bench, and stand grinders, and ensure that only trained workers are allowed to operate powder-actuated tools. All powder-actuated tools should be tested daily before use, and all defects discovered before or during use should be corrected. Powder-actuated tools shouldn't be loaded until immediately before use, and loaded tools should not be left unattended. Compressed air that's used for cleaning purposes has to be reduced to less than 30 pounds per square inch, or PSI, and provide effective chip guarding and PPE. All materials that are stored in tiers need to be secured to prevent sliding, falling, or collapsing. Employers must also ensure that tow boards are erected along the edge of overhead walking and working surfaces. Employers are also required to provide personal protective equipment, or PPE. They must pay for PPE as required by OSHA. They must provide and require the use of all appropriate PPE in all situations and operations where there is an exposure to hazardous conditions. Employers must ensure the adequacy of PPE, including proper maintenance and sanitation. Employers must provide head protection, such as hard hats, helmets, or bump caps, whenever there is a possible danger of head injuries from impact, flying, or falling objects. Employers must provide eye and face protection when machines or operations present a face or eye injury. Employers must provide workers involved in welding operations with filter lenses or plates of proper shade number. Employers must ensure that eye, face, and head protective equipment meets the ANSI requirements. Employers must train their workers. They need to train workers in the work zone to recognize hazards associated with the use of the equipment and any related duties that they are assigned to perform. They must also ensure that crane operators are qualified or certified according to OSHA standards. They must ensure that the signal person meets qualification requirements according to OSHA standards. Employers must also instruct workers in the recognition and the avoidance of unsafe conditions and the regulations that are applicable to his or her work environment. This is to control or eliminate any hazards or other exposure to injury or illness. Employers must also ensure that qualified operators and riggers have been trained on rigging safety. In 2019, there were 59 fatal caught in between accidents in construction. 13 of those were caught in or compressed by equipment or objects, and 46 of those were caught or crushed by collapsing materials. Between 2018 to 2019, the number of fatalities due to caught in between incidents, 59 or 5.4%, remained relatively constant. According to OSHA, caught in or between hazards are identified as injuries that result from a person being squeezed, caught, crushed, pinched, or compressed between two or more objects, or between parts of an object. This includes individuals who get caught or crushed in operating equipment, between other mashing objects, between a moving and stationary object, or between two or more moving objects. Events that should be classified as caught-in hazards in construction include cave-ins with trenching, being pulled into or caught into machinery and equipment. This includes strangulation as the result of caught clothing in running machinery and equipment. Being compressed or crushed between rolling, sliding, or shifting objects such as trailers, materials, concrete, dirt or gravel, or between a truck frame and a hydraulic bed that is lowering. One can be pinned between equipment and a solid object, such as a wall or another piece of equipment. Between materials being stacked or stored and a solid object, such as a wall or another piece of equipment. Or between shoring and construction materials in a trench. These types of hazards can result in multiple broken bones, asphyxiation, or death. There are different ways to protect workers from caught in between hazards on a construction site. If a worker is conducting work on machinery or equipment, the best way to stay safe is to ensure that lockout-tagout procedures are in place and are being followed. If material is being loaded, unloaded, or stacked, workers should stay a safe distance from the operation. Flowable materials such as dirt, gravel, and sand should be worked around with caution. When workers are working in or even around a trench or an excavation, the proper safety measures should be taken to prevent a cave-in. Employers are required to provide guards on power tools and other equipment with moving parts. Employers are also required to support, secure, or otherwise make equipment safe that has parts that workers could be caught between. They are also required to take measures to prevent workers from being crushed by heavy equipment that tips over. OSHA standards require the employer to ensure that handheld power tools are fitted with guards and safety switches. The type of guard will be determined by the power source of the tool, such as electric, pneumatic, liquid fuel, hydraulic, or powder actuated. Exposed moving parts of power tools, such as belts, gears, shafts, or pulleys, must be guarded. Points of operation are where the work is performed on the materials. These must also be guarded. Power saws are a primary type of equipment that requires a point of operation guard. In running nip points, such as where the sanding belt runs onto a pulley in a belt sanding machine, must also be guarded. The employer should provide a lockout-tagout program or equivalent system to ensure that the equipment is not accidentally energized during maintenance or repair. Lockout-tagout procedures are specifically required for equipment used in concrete and masonry operations. Bulldozer and scraper blades, end loader buckets, dump bodies, and similar equipment must be fully blocked or fully lowered when being repaired or not in use. The best way to prevent workers from being crushed by heavy equipment that tips over is to prevent the equipment from tipping over in the first place. For example, cranes can tip over if the load capacity is exceeded, if the ground is not level or too soft. OSHA requires that employers designate a competent person to inspect crane operations. This is to identify working conditions that are hazardous to workers, including ensuring that the support surface is firm and able to support the load. The employer must make sure that the material handling equipment is equipped with rollover protective structures. OSHA standards require that motor vehicles, forklifts, and earth-moving equipment must be equipped with seat belts. Employers must require the use of seat belts. The use of seat belts will prevent workers from being thrown from a vehicle or equipment and subsequently being crushed when the vehicle or equipment tips over. What else are employers required to do to protect workers from caught in or between hazards? They're required to take measures to prevent workers from being pinned between equipment and a solid object. They also are required to provide protection for workers during trenching and excavation work. Employers are required to take measures to prevent workers from being pinned between equipment and a solid object, such as a wall or another piece of equipment, between materials being stacked or stored and a solid object, or between shoring and construction materials in a trench. OSHA standards on trenching and excavations require the employer to designate a competent person to inspect the trenching operations. The competent person must be trained in and knowledgeable about soil classification, the use of protective systems, and the requirements of the OSHA standard. The competent person must be capable of identifying hazards and authorized to immediately eliminate hazards. The employer must ensure that all excavations that are less than 5 feet in depth are inspected by the competent person to determine if there is a need for protection. The employer must make sure that all excavations and trenches 5 feet deep or more are protected by sloping or benching, a trench box or a shield, or shoring, and that there are adequate means of access and egress from the excavation. The requirement to have a means of egress and access kicks in at 4 feet in an excavation. If an excavation is 20 feet deep or more, a registered professional engineer must design the system to protect the workers. Workers must be protected from equipment or materials that could fall or roll into excavations. This could include spoils that could fall into the trench and bury the workers. Mobile equipment used near or over an excavation presents a hazard. When mobile equipment is operated adjacent to an excavation, or when such equipment is required to approach the edge of an excavation, and the operator does not have a clear and direct view of the edge of the excavation, then a warning line must be utilized, such as barricades, hand or mechanical signals, or stop logs. If possible, the grade should be away from the excavation. If a crane or earth-moving equipment is operating directly over the top of a trench, workers should not be working underneath. More on what employers are required to do to protect workers from caught in or between hazards. Employers are required to provide a means to avoid the collapse of structure scaffolds. They're required to provide means to avoid workers being crushed by collapsing walls during demolition or other construction activities. Employers are required to designate a competent person, and employers are also required to provide training for workers. Measures need to be taken by the employer to avoid the collapse of other structures, such as scaffolds, that could bury workers underneath them. Anytime there is inadequate support, improper construction, or a shift in the components of a scaffold, there is danger of a collapse. Cinder blocks or other similar materials should not be used to support a scaffold because they could be crushed. OSHA standards require that scaffolds can only be erected, moved, dismantled, or altered under the supervision of a competent person. The competent person selects and directs the workers who erect the scaffold. These workers must be trained by a competent person on correct procedures and hazards of scaffold erection. During demolition, any standalone wall that is more than 1 story must have lateral bracing, unless the wall was designed to be standalone and is otherwise in a safe condition to be self-supporting. Jacks must have a firm foundation. If necessary, the base of a jack must be blocked or cribbed. After a load has been raised, it must be cribbed, blocked, or otherwise secured at once. OSHA defines a competent person as one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees, and one who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. The employer must designate a competent person for certain construction activities that may have caught in or between hazards. The employer shall instruct each employee in the recognition and avoidance of unsafe conditions and the regulations that are applicable to his work environment to control or eliminate any hazards or other exposure to illness or injury. The employer must train workers to perform the job and use the provided equipment safely. Out of 709 fatal construction Focus 4 injuries in 2019, 79 of them were electrocutions. That means that 11% of the fatal injuries that fall in the Focus 4 categories for 2019 were electrocutions. That's a lot for one specific hazard. Data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics show that electrocution was the 4th leading cause of death in construction in 2005, after falls to a lower level, transportation injuries, and being struck by objects and equipment, all of which are in Focus 4. An electrical hazard can be defined as a serious workplace hazard that exposes workers to the following: burns, electrocutions, shocks, arc flash, arc blast, fire, explosions, or to help you remember, be safe. The B stands for burns. A burn is the most common shock-related injury. Burns from electricity are one of these 3 types: electrical, arc or flash, or thermal contact. E stands for electrocution. Electrocution is fatal. Electrocution results when a human is exposed to a lethal amount of electrical energy. Electrocution is an injury that comes with contact with electricity, including direct contact, such as touching a live wire, and indirect contact, like contact with a pipe that is touching a power line. The S stands for shock. An electrical shock is when the body becomes part of the electrical circuit upon contact of a body part with any source of electricity that causes a flow of current through the skin, muscles, or hair. Current enters the body at one point and leaves at another. Electrical shock can be defined as a reflex response to the passage of electric current through the body. The A in Be Safe stands for arc flash or blast. An arc flash is the sudden release of electrical energy through the air when a high voltage gap exists and there is a breakdown between conductors. An arc flash gives off thermal radiation, or heat, and bright, intense light that can cause burns. The F stands for fire. Most electrical distribution fires result from problems with fixed wiring or faulty electrical outlets and old wiring. Problems with cords, such as extension and appliance cords, plugs, receptacles, and switches, also cause electrical fires. An arc flash can be spontaneous, or it can result from inadvertently bridging electrical contacts with the conducting object. Other causes may include dropped tools or the buildup of conductive dust or corrosion. The final letter, E, stands for explosions. An explosion can occur when electricity ignites an explosive mixture of material in the air. Overhead and buried power lines are especially hazardous because they carry extremely high voltage. Fatalities are possible as electrocution is the main risk. However, burns and falls from elevations are also hazards that workers are exposed to while working in the vicinity of high voltage power lines. Workers may not realize that cranes are not the only equipment that reaches overhead power lines. Working on a ladder, using or moving scaffolding, or working in a man basket suspended under or near power lines also poses the risk of electrocution. Voltages of overhead power lines can range from 120 to 750,000 volts. The most reliable way to know the voltage is to ask the utility company that owns the line. Always get verification from the owner of the line to double check to make sure that the lines are dead or that they're off. The normal wear and tear on extension and flexible cords can loosen or expose wires, creating a hazardous condition. Cords that are not 3-wire type, not designed for hard usage, or that have been modified increase the risk of contacting electrical current. With the wide use of power tools on construction sites, flexible extension cords are often necessary. Because they are exposed, flexible, and unsecured, they're more susceptible to damage than fixed wiring. Hazards are created when cords, cord connectors, receptacles, and cord and plug connected equipment are improperly used or maintained. To reduce hazards, flexible cords must connect to devices and to fittings in ways that prevent tension at joints and terminal screws. A flexible cord may be damaged by door or window edges, staples and fastenings, abrasion from adjacent materials, or simply by aging. If the electrical conductors become exposed, there is a danger of shocks, burns, or fire. When a cord connector is wet, electrical current can leak to the equipment grounding conductor and to anyone who picks up that connector if they provide a path to ground. The major hazards regarding contact with energized sources are electrical shock and burns. Electrical shock occurs when the body becomes part of the electrical circuit, either when an individual comes in contact with both wires of an electrical circuit, one wire of an energized circuit and the ground, or a metallic part that has become energized by contact with an electrical conductor. The severity and effects of an electrical shock depend on a number of factors, such as the pathway through the body, the amount of current, the length of time of the exposure, and whether the skin is wet or dry. Water is a great conductor of electricity, allowing current to flow more easily in wet conditions and through wet skin. Electrical burns can be arc burns, thermal contact burns, or combination of burns. Electrical burns are among the most serious burns, and they also require immediate medical attention. They occur when an electric current flows through tissue or bone, generating heat that causes tissue damage. The body cannot dissipate the heat generated by current flowing through the resistance of the tissue. Therefore, burns occur. Lockout tagout is an essential safety procedure that protects workers from injury while working on or near electrical circuits and equipment. In addition, lockout tagout prevents contact with operating equipment parts, such as blades, gears, shafts, etc. Also, lockout tagout prevents the unexpected release of hazardous gases, fluids, or solid matter in areas where workers are present. To protect workers against being electrocuted, workers need to follow lockout tagout procedures. What are employers required to do to protect workers from electrocutions? They are required to ensure overhead power line safety, to isolate electrical parts, and to supply ground fault circuit interrupters, or GFCIs. There are 3 major ways employers should control power line hazards: by maintaining a safe distance from lines, having the power company de-energize and ground the power lines, have a power company representative at the site, and having the power company install insulated sleeves, also known as eels, over power lines. Employers should train workers regarding power line hazards and about the available protective measures. Workers need to be fully informed about what jobs may have electrical hazards and the measures they will take to control the hazards. Electrical parts, conductors entering boxes, cabinets, or fittings shall be protected from abrasion, and openings through which conductors enter and shall be effectively closed. Unused openings in cabinets, boxes, and fittings shall also be effectively closed. All pull boxes, junction boxes, and fittings shall be provided with covers. Metal covers shall be grounded. In energized installations, each outlet box should have a cover, faceplate, or a fixture canopy. Covers of outlet boxes having holes through which flexible cord pendants pass shall be provided with bushings. OSHA ground fault protection rules and regulations have been determined necessary and appropriate for worker safety and health. Therefore, it is the employer's responsibility to provide either A, a ground fault circuit interrupter on construction sites for receptacle outlets that are in use and not part of permanent wiring of the building or structure, or B, a scheduled and recorded assured equipment grounding conductor program on all construction sites, covering all cord sets, receptacles which are not part of the permanent wiring of the building or structure, and equipment that's connected by cord and plug, which are available for use or used by workers. What are employers required to do to protect workers from electrocutions? They're required to ensure that power tools are maintained in a safe condition, ensure proper guarding. They're required to provide training. Employers are required to enforce a lockout tagout safety-related work practices and ensure the proper use of flexible cords. The employer needs to ensure that all power tools and equipment are maintained in a safe condition to ground power supply systems, electrical circuits, and electrical equipment. Frequently inspect electrical systems to ensure path to ground is continuous. Ensure that workers understand to inspect electrical equipment prior to use. And ensure that ground prongs are not removed from tools or extension cords. And to ground exposed metal parts of equipment. Guarding involves locating or enclosing electrical equipment to ensure workers do not accidentally come into contact with its live parts. Effective guarding requires equipment with exposed parts operating at 50 volts or more to be placed where they're accessible only to authorized people qualified to work on the equipment. Workers need to be trained in and familiar with the safety-related work practices that pertain to their respective job assignments. They need to train the workers that are working with electrical equipment in safe work practices to de-energize electrical equipment before inspecting or repairing, to use cords and cables and electrical tools that are in good repair. They need to train workers on lockout tagout recognition and procedures and to use the appropriate PPE. Extension cords must be 3-wire type so they may be grounded and to permit grounding of any tools or equipment connected to them. Thank you for viewing this webinar for the Focus 4 Hazards in Construction. For more information about each topic discussed in this webinar, check out the e-training tab on KYSafe's website at www.kysafe.ky.gov.